Welcome to the Modern Husbands Podcast, where any combination of Dr. Bruce Ross, Christian Sherrill, and Brian Page host national experts who share winning ideas to manage money in the home as a team. I'm Brian Page, founder of Modern Husbands. Sometimes our listeners want more support than a podcast can give, individual or couple support, which I now provide. Details can be found at modernhusbands.com, or you can email me at brian@modernhusbands.com. For today's podcast, we welcome Dr. Jenny Olson, an assistant professor of marketing at Indiana University's Kelley School of Business. Dr. Olson just released research examining how people predict happiness from buying something, then what actually happens and whether it matters if you're poor or you're rich, and how that impacts how you feel about it. Enjoy the show. Dr. Olson, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, before we dive into the topic for the day, which is how income impacts enjoyment of consumption experiences, can you provide an overview of your groundbreaking research about joint bank accounts for engaged and first-time married couples?
Yes, absolutely. So my co-authors and I published a paper not too long ago where we looked at the marital benefits of having joint accounts. Prior to our work, there was some correlational evidence suggesting that couples who merge finances tend to be happier than couples who don't. But one of the big questions that we didn't have an answer to was, well, it's possible that merging accounts makes people happy, but happier people might also be more likely to merge accounts. And so we wanted to disentangle the direction of that effect. And so we conducted a very ambitious longitudinal field experiment where we recruited hundreds of couples that were entering their first marriage. Everybody had separate accounts, and we followed them for 2 years as they transitioned across what we call the connubial crucible, that time of marriage that can dictate, the dynamics that are observed early on in the first 2 years of marriage can predict long-term marital fate. And so we randomly assigned them to different conditions, have joint bank accounts, have separate accounts, maintain what you have, or to that third condition, which was a no intervention condition. And I like to think of that as the choose your own adventure path. And we followed them, and we do find that, merging your finances in a joint account predicts greater happiness over time across that critical time period relative to separate bank accounts and the no intervention control. So our research is really the first to demonstrate these longitudinal dynamics, and it speaks to the power of merging with your partner.
I want to reiterate to the listeners how impactful this is because, it was covered by the New York Times. And it's always been a question that I get, that many people get about managing money in your marriage. Do we join accounts or not? And there's a couple things that I want to reinforce. First, this was for first-time married couples. This was for engaged couples. And what I like about the outcome of this is that it gives people a starting point where if you're not certain what to do going into your marriage, try this first, because the research says that on the aggregate, this is most effective in terms of marital happiness. And then if that doesn't work, then you can try other systems, which we've done past podcast episodes over. But I wanted to make sure we started with that because it's such a revelation that people need to be aware of. Let's transition into the topic for today. Can you briefly describe your recent study on how income impacts enjoyment of consumption experiences? Buying things, consumption, buying things. Yeah.
How could we be happy with what we call psychological consumption experiences? And so before I talk about the specifics of the research, I wanted to highlight where this idea came from, because I suspect a lot of your listeners maybe have observed these different patterns in the marketplace as well. And so one of my co-authors is an avid Disney fan. Okay, we're going to be talking about Disney World today, Disneyland.
Okay.
And she absolutely loves Disney. Like, she has an annual pass. She goes all the time. And so we were talking about getting together sometime and going to Disney. And I was like, this is a great idea. This sounds fun. And she, our phones, I swear, are listening because I started getting targeted ads for Disney. And one of them really stood out to me, and it was for a Disney savings account. And I looked into it. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was a program that they had. And it was like a vacation planning platform, right? So it allowed people to save money for a specific Disney trip. And I remember thinking, this is a great idea. This can help, consumers across the income spectrum, better plan and budget for a trip, because we know that Disney can be quite expensive. And so I'm like, oh, this is a great financial product. And so I was looking at the responses. So I think this was on like an Instagram account, and I was looking at the comments, and people were nasty. They were very negative.
Really?
Yes, they were like, if you need a savings account to go to Disney, then you shouldn't be going.
Oh, that's pretty judgmental.
Yeah, and that is a big theme of
That's
my
also not, that's also really inappropriate, because it's
right.
good to have separate savings accounts for separate purposes. Anyhow, sorry to interrupt. I find that interesting.
No, for sure. And I did too, because I'm like, oh, this is a great idea. There's a lot of work on mental accounting and budgeting. And,
Yeah.
to me, I'm like, this is responsible. You're planning accordingly versus financing on a credit card, right?
Yeah.
People are nasty. I will say, Brian, because I have a lot of work in this space about how we evaluate or judge other people's consumption as a function of their income. And so what we were seeing in just the comments and the different sentiments is people believed that, if you needed to save money in an account, then you can't afford it. If you can't afford to put food on your table, then you don't deserve
Wow.
the happiness that Disney provides. And we see this over and over again. There's these stories about, families that are lower income purchasing birthday cakes for their family and people getting upset about it. Like, it's like, how dare you do this? You should be making it from scratch, et cetera, et cetera. And so my co-author, Andrea Morales, and I, we started talking about this, and we were like, do we think that people derive less happiness from these sorts of experiences as a function of their income? Would we have this same judgment toward people on the higher end of the income spectrum?
Right.
We suspect not. And we had published a few papers in this space. And so we launched a project to look at the inferences we make about other people as a function of their income. And so the paper that we'll talk about today in particular, what we find. So what we do is we look at what are called psychological consumption experiences. These are experiences that satisfy mental benefits. So think like talking on a podcast, listening to podcasts, reading books, going to a play, going to a concert, going to a professional sporting event, going to the Taylor Swift Eras tour. All these sorts of things can help satisfy mental needs as opposed to physical needs like eating a sandwich or drinking water.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we did is we ran a series of studies, and we held the experience constant, and we manipulated the income of the person doing it. And what we find is that people expect lower income consumers to enjoy an identical experience significantly less than ourselves. What's really interesting is we expect higher income consumers to enjoy that exact same experience significantly more than ourselves.
That
So
doesn't sound right.
yeah, there's this simultaneous asymmetry. And, what we find is driving this effect, it all comes down to needs and need
Mm-hmm.
prioritization. What needs do we think people should be focusing on?
Wow. Okay. So
There's
I
lots
really
of
want to dig in. This is so
lots.
what was most what was most surprising from your findings, from your research regarding income and income levels and
Mhm.
happiness?
Honestly, I think the most surprising feature is the fact that these judgments are really strong. We've replicated this effect over and over again, but I think the most important thing is that they are erroneous. There is a bias. So we think that people will enjoy these experiences differentially as a function of their income. But when we actually recruit people that have gone to a concert, have gone to a professional sporting event, have went and saw a show at the theater, and we measure their actual happiness and then we correlate it with income, we find that income does not predict happiness. And in fact, it's the opposite at some point.
That's what
So
I would have imagined.
we got secondary data from a professional sports team, and we find that lower income consumers were reporting significantly greater satisfaction with that experience than their higher income counterparts. And going back to the needs, what I want to emphasize is kind of the thing that we found is, are you familiar with Maslow's hierarchy?
Yes. But our listeners might not be.
Yes. So if listeners are not, so Maslow Abraham Maslow was a humanistic psychologist who argued that humans have to satisfy needs in this sequential way. So we have to start with physical needs, like physiological. We need to eat, we need to drink water. Then we get into security needs. Okay, safety, shelter, clothing, physical safety, things like that. And then we get into belongingness. We want to fit in with others, family, friends, connection. Then we go to esteem, which is all about egoistic and, prestige and standing out from others, all the way up to the pinnacle, which is self actualization. This is being the
Hmm.
best possible version of yourself. And so Maslow, you know, kind of implied this linear progression. And so we started with that idea in our paper because we know from just our own experiences that we don't have to satisfy things in a linear way, right? Like I can risk my physical safety to fit in with friends. Think about
Right.
teenagers going on joyrides and things. And so what we find though, and even Maslow himself was like, oh, you know what? It's not as linear as I originally proposed. But what we find is that consumers hold what's called a lay belief or an intuition that needs do need to be satisfied in a linear sequential way. And then that's what's impacting and driving our findings. So people assume that lower income consumers they're overestimating the degree to which they're struggling to satisfy these basic level needs. So they have to focus here before they can pursue higher level needs and happiness, essentially. Versus higher income consumers, they probably have enough food and water, like go ahead and go on that, that trip or read that book, etc. And so, but the important thing is when we ask people, going back to your question about the surprising piece, when you actually ask people across the income spectrum, how important is it to satisfy these various tiers of needs? There is no income difference, right? It's not that lower income consumers value water and food any more than anybody else. These are basic human needs that everybody has to fulfill to survive. But what's important is that psychological need fulfillment is something that everybody desires, everyone wants. This is something that's really important, and that's kind of one of the big messages of our work, is that people erroneously think that these needs have to be satisfied in a linear way, but in reality they don't.
Now, the people who feel that way, is it across the board, including low income folks?
Yes.
So
So
they're saying that about, they're predicting their own happiness of doing something, what, going to Disney World or buying a concert ticket or whatever, based on uh, their, inherent beliefs of, I know not everybody knows what Maslow's hierarchy of needs is, but I think a lot of us have the intuition that we need to have all of those things settled. Now, like, security, food, shelter, clothing.
right.
Um, and I want to hone in on this for a moment. So are you saying that people should just wildly spend money and not have their basic needs met? Or are you perhaps saying that maybe in life we need timeouts from that, and a timeout could be a concert?
Yes. So, and that's an important point to make, is that I'm not necessarily saying, hey, everybody should blow up their monthly budget, YOLO, live for today, go to the concert, spend thousands of dollars on traveling the world. Um, you can engage in, free and low cost psychological consumption experiences. So listening to a podcast is free on average, right? Or
Yeah.
going to a free theater program. So it's not about being able to afford the experiences. I actually like what you said, is that it's more about taking time to recognize that happiness can come from these things. And that financial stability and security isn't necessarily a prerequisite for experiencing happiness from higher level pursuits.
Listeners have told us that they love the ideas we share on our podcast to manage money in the home as a team, but want more help than one episode can provide. That's why I'm excited to announce On the Same Page Consulting for corporations, couples, and individuals. Visit modernhusbands.com and click Our Services at the top of the page to learn more about how I can help you or your employees manage money in the home as a team. Again, that's modernhusbands.com. Now back to the show.
So what are, and you've covered this, I think, or at least kind of like bit around the edges, but I want to make sure that we provide some clarity here. How do common misconceptions about income levels affect people's expectations of happiness from their experiences?
I think it goes back to that bias that we incorrectly believe that we have to have all physical things in place before we can pursue higher level happiness. I often think about some of my family members, and maybe you've talked to people too, that it's like save, 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 save. We have to have, the best house, the best, all this sort of stuff. But in reality, you can still pursue happiness before some of these other things. Now, again, we all have to have food to survive. We all have to have adequate
Right.
shelter and clothing. And like, I'm not saying that. Like you said, it's more about taking the time to start a new hobby just to fulfill that important psychological needs, because we do know from work that psychological need fulfillment, not just physical, is more predictive of happiness. So
Right. Right. And there's a lot that, we could dive into there with like Waldiger's research at Harvard. And
mhm.
one of the things that I'm referring back to for my own personal life is my newfound love for pickleball. And it's kind of like the rage for middle-aged people, or actually of all ages. Should not have segmented it into, middle-aged people. But I feel like that there's so many boxes that are checked from what we know makes people happier with
Right.
pickleball. The social aspect, obviously, the exercise that you get, competition, and then, when you're talking about like consumption of experiences. And I just received in the mail finally my new pickleball paddle. I've been looking forward to this for a week, and I cannot wait until I play pickleball later today. And it's one of those things, I think, that is a timeout from like the challenges of kind of dredging through the monotony of everyday life, that gives us an opportunity to stop and appreciate the joy of those little experiences. And
Mhm.
a lot of our listeners are busy dual career couples, and for them, they have to be that time is precious. They have to be strategic about it. So considering our audience, based on what you've learned, what do you think that they can do, again, based on your research, to enhance their own happiness?
Right. So I think one of the big takeaways is that, people, including couples, we tend to underestimate how much happiness these sorts of experience can bring us, especially when we're, stretched thin at work and we have
Hmm.
financial responsibilities. But I do think our research shows that people, assume that happiness from these psychological consumption experiences depends on financial status. But in reality, we're finding that income has little to no impact on the actual joy that people derive from these experiences. So like you said, it could be as simple as, the pickleball thing. And I'll share a little bit about my own hobbies is, I really like playing Zelda, to be
Oh
honest.
yeah. Okay.
Like I just, it's that little bit of a departure,
Yep.
and it brings me joy. It's a moment of peace. And yeah, I think that we tend to get so caught up in some of these things, but again, just to reiterate, these moments of joy can be free and cost nothing or be, very little. So,
Are these psychological consumption experiences things that there's action behind it? You have to do something with it, whether it's a video game, a pickleball paddle, or could you put like purchasing a new couch or sitting chairs under that umbrella?
yeah, so there's a lot of research looking at, material versus experiential purchases. And
Hmm.
so we focused largely on psychological consumption experiences, but we also looked at products as well. So we had a study where we compared a survival gift box with a nurture gift box.
What does
So,
that mean?
so here's a fleece blanket and a book, like things that are concrete physical products, but they can still satisfy, mental needs.
Okay.
So a home decor magazine we looked at, but also things like Headspace subscriptions and that sort of thing, language learning, Rosetta Stone, but it's also physical goods as well. And I mean, something like a couch, it's not just a couch, it's a place for your family to come together, you know,
Yeah. Okay.
so you can still create those psychological experiences with physical products. And we know from a ton of research, and I think you kind of hinted at it, that these experiences spent with others, there's this added benefit of psychological, need satisfaction.
Let's hone in on what you mean by consumption experience. So
Mhm.
and I want to be thoughtful of people who perhaps equate spending with joy, like our friend Dr. Scott Rick, right? He's a spendthrift. Okay. Let's say it's somebody who is a compulsive buyer, right? Which is not good. They can't take their foot off the gas. And they just buy like clothes that they think that they'll like or want to wear in the future. Is that a consumption experience?
So as we define it, no. So we're defining consumption experiences as, well, I should say we differentiate between psychological and physical.
Okay.
And the way we differentiate these two things are experiences that help satisfy mental needs versus physical needs. So like clothing, yeah, it can satisfy physical needs by, protecting my body from the elements, but it can also satisfy esteem needs, like to feel like I'm wearing luxurious and like status driven kind of stuff. So that we're more talking about kind of physical versus mental.
And so, for somebody to maximize a consumption experience, give me, when I say somebody, I mean couples. Let's say it's couples who are deciding that they want to do some things together. Give me some examples of how they can do that.
So some of the ideas for our listeners would be like taking a weekend getaway,
Okay.
having a moment of connection. It could be, so my husband and I do this after the kids go to bed, let's sit down and just talk and connect. It could be, like I mentioned, going to a concert, going on a walk around the neighborhood, just taking a moment to help kind of calm your mind, practicing mindfulness. I love the idea of doing couples massages. Now that can get, pricier, but that's where it comes on, maybe give each other a massage,
Mm-hmm.
Taking a moment away from the hustle and bustle to help reset and recharge your mind.
Is that something that people should schedule?
I think so. So one thing I haven't mentioned is I have another paper that we are currently working on, and we look at self-care. So,
Okay.
we define that as intentionally engaging in behaviors that help enhance your well-being. This can be physical well-being, this can be psychological well-being. And we find that people, spoiler alert, people prioritize other people's self-care more than their own, right?
Really?
Yeah. So it's like,
Does that make them happier?
we don't look at happiness yet per se, but
Okay.
I think we know from a ton of research that neglecting self-care, in other words, tied to my current work, neglecting psychological need fulfillment is not good. Like this leads to burnout. This leads to unhappiness, actually. Yeah. So I would agree with that. But one of the things that we suggest is scheduling it and being intentional. Now, there's a fine line there because then it becomes work and productivity, right? So
Yeah.
it's like one more thing on the to-do list. So I understand why that's difficult, but we really, like the idea of an accountability buddy. And I think in partnerships, that's the perfect person. Like, it's not just self-care, it's us care. Let's make sure we go on that date night. Let's take a step away. These things are going to facilitate a long-term commitment to each other, but also our happiness.
Well, I like how you looped us into the fact that self-care can be care that you do with each other as a couple.
Right.
Because, I would imagine that could be animosity if like one person's getting a massage every week and the other person's working 80 hours.
Yes.
So that it needs to be reciprocated. And, when I think about self-care and scheduling self-care for the future, it just dawned on me that, and I'll go back to pickleball. I guess I'm a little bit of a fanatic, but they're building an indoor facility, really close to where I'm living. And I joined, it's not done until the summer, but I joined just because, in Atlanta, it gets hot and muggy in the summer and, it rains and windy and, you don't want to have an interruption to playing. But the challenge that all of us were discussing is that right now, there's a park that's within 5 to 10 minutes of where I live, 8 pickleball courts lit, and we just have a group chat and we just show up. And even if we show up and there's not enough people there from our group, there's always like 40 people there. So we don't have to schedule anything. We just kind of like look at the flow of the day and decide, hey, now is a good time. And our fear is that in an indoor facility, are we going to have to schedule things? And none of us want to do that because we have busy lives, and it's like, God, that almost adds to some stress. rather
Right.
than and it's interesting that you bring that up, that you have to be cautious about scheduling too much self-care. It can be counterproductive.
Mhm.
How is this research, going back to, consumption experiences, um, you finding that not only is it not something that is enjoyed more by higher income folks, but it's actually an inverse of that, where people who maybe are living more check by check take that little weekend getaway, even if maybe it's just camping, and they disproportionately enjoy it more. How has that type of research influenced your own views on money, happiness, and consumption?
So, yeah, it's honestly made me more cognizant of my own spending behavior as well as judgments towards others. So, one thing that comes up a lot. So, this last weekend I took my 5-year-old to Monster Jam. And it's like this big truck event and I was like,
Oh yeah, I
I,
still remember that from when I
yeah,
was a kid.
I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna like, I don't know. This is not really my scene, right? And so I get there and I'm just like looking around and I took like an anthropological standpoint and I was like, everyone.
So Dr. Olson, how many others in the audience at that Monster Jam were taking an anthropological standpoint?
Well,
Sorry,
no,
go ahead.
the researcher in me was very intrigued by the, just the diversity of people coming
Yes.
together to enjoy this single experience. And everyone was having so much fun. And I just, I was looking around and thinking like, we can't tell by looking at others if they've saved for
Yeah.
months to attend this event, if they are putting it on their credit card, all of these things. And it doesn't matter. It's not our place to judge how other people spend money. Now, I've got lots of papers showing we do it, but I don't think it's in our best interest, right? Like,
Sure.
people have resources and they're making a choice largely to probably facilitate their happiness. And you know what? I enjoyed that experience. And I bet you all those people equally enjoyed that experience. And so it made me think about my own biases that I have, as well as, just this idea that even though we think, people across the income spectrum value different things or prioritize different things or derive different happiness, it's just not true. At the end of the day, we all want happiness and deserve access to that.
So there's a striking difference between a brilliant woman like you and a simple-minded man like me, because never would it have dawned on me as I'm at that event to look at the crowd and start to determine where they stand within that spectrum, because I would have been fascinated by the giant trucks just crumbling cars all throughout the.
I will say, my daughter and like the first 10 minutes, I was like, oh. And the video I took, there's a big crash and I was like, oh my gosh, are they okay? And then you realize that's part of the fun.
Yeah.
And it was so fun. I really enjoyed it more than I
Who do you
expected.
think enjoyed it more, the people in the crowd or the drivers?
Mm, probably the people in the crowd because you could
Okay.
see all of it going down. You could see the spectacle of people, they're like flying over the paths and things. And so, I just, yeah, it was really fun. And now I'm going to want to go next year. And I have a toddler and I think he'll be old enough to go next year. And I think he's going to absolutely love it. So
Oh,
it'll be, we're going to
that's gonna be great.
schedule it. We're dedicated. We're going to go fulfill our psychological needs by going to Monster Jam.
What do you think would be a better way to spend time and money if you won the lottery? To buy an enormous house, or to actually get trained to be the driver in the Monster Jam of one of those giant trucks?
I think I would buy the big house and I'd invite them over.
That's okay. I would be the driver.
I'm going to combine them to maximize my enjoyment. And then I would talk to them. We'd have some drinks. We'd recount tales.
I
And
love it.
night.
Uh, so we love to end our podcast by sharing like one practical way that couples can apply insights from the topic of that episode, which today is the study of consumption experiences. What is some advice, at least one piece of practical advice that people can take action on right now in their lives?
I would say, and actually I'm pulling this from lots of different work, is to do things together. Right?
Love it.
Just simply as that. There's lots of research on the power of joint experiences, and my work shows that these endeavors can facilitate happiness.
As always, such a great conversation. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Don't leave just yet. Be sure to like and subscribe before you do. And a reminder to visit modernhusbands.com if you're looking for money and home management support in your life. Just click the Our Services button at the top of the page. Again, that's at modernhusbands.com. And many thanks to our co hosts, our guests, and of course, all of you for joining today.